Josef, I'm delighted to see you again after all this time, and thanks very much for coming this evening, and it's good to sit down and have a chat together. The thing I thought that I'd like to talk to you about, though, is NATO operations. You recall, because like me, you've been in the security policy business for a long, long time, that if you went to a conference a couple of months ago on operations, people were sort of saying, well, you know, Afghanistan, that's the last one. You know, we've had this very difficult, grueling experience in Afghanistan. It's cost a lot of lives, you know, coming in the wake of Iraq, it's cost a lot of money. It's been very difficult to reconstruct Afghanistan, particularly after 20 years of war. And, you know, once we get to 2014, when the ISAF mission is due to come to an end.
That's it.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. You know, we're going to come home. We're going to have a break from operations. We're going to sort of, you know, reinvest our money in new equipment. We're going to retrain our troops. You know, it will be the end of, you know, what we once called liberal interventionism of the 1990s. And yet, you know, as you know, like me, you've probably been very surprised to see NATO starting a new operation, let alone finishing old ones, with now the operation in Libya, the no-fly zone, the arms embargo. So, I mean, what do you think? Are operations going to dominate NATO's existence for the next 10 years the way they've dominated for the last 20 years?
Well, I think so. I think so because it's part of today's world. You know, we're so interconnected. We're so much dependent on each other and on the, you know, the way we work, the way we trade, the way we produce, means that every crisis somewhere in the world will have some externalities on us, and will raise the question: is our security at stake? Are our citizens in danger? Because we have European citizens, NATO citizens, all over the place. Americans, Canadians, Europeans, they are all over. So there will always be a likelihood that situations come up that require some action. And I'd say it's not at all excluded that we'll see more of instability, that we'll see more parts of the world that find it just too hard to cope with this kind of world where you have conflicts breaking up, where you have bad governance, where you simply have situations in which order breaks down. And then the question comes, who can rebuild order? And oftentimes that question will be addressed to NATO.
Yeah, but do you think that NATO is always going to be, if you like, the default option in all of these crises? For example, we saw at the beginning of the Libya crisis an international coalition initially taking action, at least for the first weeks. And then the debate seemed to come towards NATO as being, if you like, the only solution to carry out the operations over a longer period of time. Do you still believe that NATO has a kind of, if I can put it that way, almost sort of global monopoly of operations, because this organization is the only one that can really do them?
Well, I hope not, you know, because over time it would clearly overburden NATO. And also politically, I think it is not good if there's always just one institutional framework or one set of actors that is able to respond to a crisis. So I think it would be good for the international community and us if indeed we had a few more regional organizations similar to NATO in their own quality who had the ability to do this. I think NATO will always come in when there is some kind of interest involved, some kind of engagement involved of the United States, because NATO for the United States is the most responsive framework, and after all, NATO is also inbuilt or structured cooperation of military interaction between the partners in the North Atlantic Alliance. So even if the United States is not in the lead, still NATO gives them the best access to see what's going on and to have a voice in the operations.
Yeah, this is what you say is interesting there, because a lot of people have picked up in Libya the fact that the United States now has withdrawn from the combat operations, although the US was very heavily involved early on. When I say combat, I mean the physical enforcement of the no-fly zone in the early days. And the US seems now, of course, with its budget deficit problems and in the wake of the experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, not wanting maybe to take the lead in the way that it once did. For example, as you know, because like me, you've observed these things for many years, NATO operations have always depended upon this extremely disproportionate participation of the US. I mean, take Afghanistan, where 90,000 of 140,000 troops are American, or Bosnia, Kosovo, where the Americans were between a third and a half of the total. If the US now, because of these financial pressures, or because of the experience of Afghanistan and Iraq, is now sort of retreating to a less frontline role, is this going to be good, you think, for NATO? It's burden sharing across the Atlantic, or do you think it's really going to be very bad for NATO, because NATO simply won't be able to do these things if the Americans don't play their traditional leadership role?
Well, in general, I would assume it's good for NATO if and when NATO can demonstrate the alliance can do it, or the alliance can do it through alliance means, and not just be, you know, another variant of a U.S. engagement. I would think that for the United States, it also makes sense to look towards NATO, not only because of financial constraints, but also for political reasons. I think pretty much the same applies what we just discussed. If it was the United States as the indispensable actor in all of the crises, in all of the situations where military needs to be brought into the play, it would kind of narrow down the global political role of the United States to that of a policeman. Maybe a kind policeman, a helping policeman, but after all, still a policeman. And I think the U.S. would like to be perceived as one of the principal players, but not always as the only one and the indispensable one.
But do you think, in that respect, that the Europeans are ready to step up to the mark? I mean, I suppose in Libya, again, you saw President Sarkozy in France initially being the leader in forming the international coalition, and I think also France was the first to begin the enforcement of the no-fly zone. So that's positive. The UK is there as well. Many other European allies are involved. But would Libya, for you, represent a kind of coming of age of Europe now in the alliance in terms of being prepared to take over more of the burden from the United States, or is this really an illusion? And as I said, you know, without this big US role, it's going to be difficult to sustain these missions in the longer run.
Well, I'd say that Libya had a lot to do, with the proximity to Europe, with the fact that the externalities of that conflict will first of all be visible in Europe and then later in the international community. Also, it is partly due to the fact that the European powers were not spot on when change happened in Tunisia and later on in Egypt. So I think there is a little bit of compensation to saying when the third case comes, and this seems to turn into a very nasty conflict one, then at least we got to do something. We got to stop this. We got to rebuild our credibility as actors who, after all, are in favor of change towards better governance, more open markets, more democracy, more participation of the people. So I think we're seeing this. We may not see this in other cases. We may not see this when it's further away from Europe. We may not see it even in sub-Saharan Africa, where there still is a lot of European engagement and interest. But you know, these will be different circumstances. But as long as we're talking about the periphery of the European Union, the periphery of the Europe's NATO members, I think we will still rely on the fact that there will be European initiative in this, whether it be through NATO or possibly someday through the EU.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that it's also interesting that at a time when NATO's land forces have been very stretched, because we've got Afghanistan where the numbers have gone up. They'll start coming down, but they've been going up. We've still, as you know, got the operation going on in Kosovo, the KFOR force, although that's gone down, but still 10,000 forces involved. There are other NATO operations around, which have been basically driven by land forces. I suppose in a way it's a good thing that the Libya operation has involved more naval forces with the arms embargo. and also air assets, of course, with the no-fly zone, because obviously, although air power was a big instrument in the former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia back in '95 or in Kosovo in '99, it hasn't been such a major factor with the stabilization operations since. So in a way, you could argue that NATO had excess naval forces or excess air forces, which could be fortunately used in Libya. But if you have to then start using a stabilization force in Libya as well, where the stretch really is, it could start getting difficult for the alliance. But we're not there yet. I mean, there's no mandate, of course, to do that at the moment. The operation is an air one. But I also think that what's interesting is that, in the past, you usually sort of ended a conflict, had a breathing space before another one came along. So you're only sort of doing one at a time. But what's interesting is that Libya is happening when NATO is far from the exit in Afghanistan, another 3 years. As we've said, we still have this force in Kosovo, at least for a while. There's still a residual operation in Bosnia, although that's fortunately nearly over. The EU has the main responsibility. There's a piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden. There's a counter-terrorist operation in the Mediterranean. There's a training mission in Iraq. Do you not sometimes wonder that it's much easier to start these missions than to end previous ones? And there must be a limit eventually to how many missions even NATO is able to do simultaneously. If new ones begin, but old ones never seem to end.
But when you look at the operations, and I wonder what your view would be on that. If you look at NATO's operations, you will see that when it comes to achieving the immediate military goal, when it comes to ending a conflict or bring about a situation in which reconstruction of some sort, negotiations of some sort can begin, NATO is very effective. Sometimes it takes longer, sometimes it takes shorter than anybody expects, but the hard part begins thereafter. And I think this is where the whole issue of comprehensive security comes in, where NATO indeed is at risk of being overstretched, and it would go further and be more efficient, the more it could interact with other institutions of providing soft security, post-conflict security, reconstruction, and training. I think that's the key question. I wonder, where NATO stands on this today. Comprehensive security, political, military cooperation, civil military cooperation. These key words you hear all the time. What's behind this?
Well, I think you've put your finger on the difficult point there very well, because I remember, having been around for a long time here, that when we first went with the ground force into Bosnia, and even Kosovo, back in the 1990s, almost by magic, the EU was there with a very large mission. The OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, was looking at organizing elections and looking for missing persons and so on. The World Bank was there to help with the economy. The UN was playing, of course, a major role in Kosovo. As you know, the UN provided a kind of government, the UNMIC as it was called for a while. And so this sort of civil-military coordination sort of happened naturally because the other key institutions were there. They gave Kosovo, Bosnia the same priority as we did. They put their best people there. And I remember being years ago in Sarajevo, every morning the so-called principals, the heads of these organizations, would get together for breakfast and they would say, right, what are we doing today? We're doing this. We would then say, how can we help you? We're off to arrest a war criminal today. Can you provide us with backup or whatever? Or we need to build this road. Can you help us with your military engineers? There was a lot of coordination. And when we first went to Afghanistan in 2003, we sort of expected, somewhat naively, as it turned out, that this same kind of cast of characters, all of the various institutions would be there once again, and we could just start again where we left off, in Bosnia or Kosovo. But of course they weren't.
Does NATO feel comfortable at that? This is often it's an almost chaotic, non-hierarchical kind of relationship. We don't have a superstructure that would somehow bring together all of these organizations and tell each one what to do. Yeah. So it has to be bargained over, it has to be talked about. Yeah. A lot of that then is left to the principals on the ground, and if they happen to cooperate very well.
If they get on in terms of their personalities.
It works, but you know, it seems to me that NATO, with its very strong tradition in the planning and executing of military operations, sometimes has a different philosophy in running things than these genuinely civic institutions, the development assistance agencies, and what have you. You know, is what do you think? What needs to be done in order to get this these interplays as effective and as efficient as possible?
I think again, this is as our Americans friends say, the $64,000 question. I think there are many things, at least based on my experience here. The first one, of course, is it would help if the international organisations had the same strategic alignment. For example, if you look at our relationship with the European Union, they conduct their own operations under the Common Foreign and Security Policy, but they don't always give the priority to the same regions of the world where NATO is engaging. And sometimes it also, speaking personally, strikes me as interesting that Europe has 10 times more soldiers under NATO command in Afghanistan as it has in the European Common Foreign Security Policy operations. So I'm not arguing that Afghanistan is the only place which deserves our attention. Unfortunately, there are many other crisis areas in the world, and it's difficult to say that X is more important than Y. But still, if at least among the institutions we could have more strategic alignment, as we had in the 90s, when everybody agreed that, you know, Bosnia, Kosovo were the focus, that would help. My old boss as Secretary General of NATO, Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, once told me a story that he'd been in London talking to Tony Blair, who was still Prime Minister, and said, "Prime Minister, in the European Union, do you ever discuss Afghanistan?" And Tony Blair had answered, "Well, no." Now it's different today. I want to make clear the EU has a mission in Afghanistan, but I think, you know, I come back to my point, we need the institutions to have the same common set of priorities. That helps. I think the other thing is that when we first went to Afghanistan in 2003, the military, as I said, did a military plan assuming that the civilian actors would be there, and therefore the military would not have to do reconstruction, schools, elections, police training. Of course, we were wrong, and we've had to improvise with mission creep, with so-called provincial reconstruction teams to do those things. So I think the second element in trying to answer your question is that before we do a mission, our military need to know what the others are going to do or not going to do, where they're going to be, with which resources, what help they need. So at least you go in, to quote an American movie, eyes wide open rather than eyes wide shut. And that's why when we did the NATO strategic concept, you remember last year, we agreed after some debate that NATO will now have these civilian planners who will sort of put together. But the third element, and I think you're right here, is there is a cultural problem. You know, as you're right, everybody likes to coordinate, but doesn't like to be coordinated. Who's in charge? I mean, it's easier when you have the UN as the most representative organisation taking the lead with a senior representative who does the coordination. But you're right, we need to change the cultures so that the military find it easier to understand civilians, and vice versa. The civilians do not feel that the military is there to complicate their lives, and that's not easy.
I sometimes get the impression when listening to commanders, when listening to security assessments, be it in Afghanistan, be it in Iraq, or be it now in the case of North Africa, that the military is quite aware of the fact that guns don't solve the political problem. You know, they can bring about a situation in which then there is a moment of choice, or there is an opportunity to do things differently. But I think what we find very hard, and that speaks to governments, because it's governments given the power to NATO, to military instruments to be applied, and it's governments who are setting the goals, who are defining the post-conflict situation, that oftentimes in such an operation, which is risky, which is costly, we are finding ourselves in a situation where we say, once we solve the military problem there, everything else will fall into place. Yeah. And we see in Afghanistan how difficult it is because it has to come from the people inside the country. Yeah. And we can at best be assistant to what they want to do for themselves. And we will see that in Libya after the conflict, that it's essentially up to the people in Libya to define the kind of outcome. You know, and I get the impression that oftentimes when we apply military means, we also tend to oversell the political outcome in order to justify the risk and the cost of it. And I oftentimes look at the military planners and see how reluctant they are to easily underwrite such a statement, because they know how hard it is. That's an entirely different story.
No, I agree, because looking back again at the Balkans in the 90s, in many respects we had things there which made our life easier that we don't have in Libya, that we don't have in Afghanistan. You remember that NATO troops went in on the ground when the fighting had stopped. You know, we had the Dayton Peace Agreement, or we had the military technical agreement in Kosovo. People signed on the dotted line and were prepared to disarm and give up the armed struggle. That didn't mean that the political debates and arguments didn't continue, but at least the fighting stopped. So that helped. There was a genuine peace to keep. I think the second thing was that there was this sort of regional international group. You remember, like the Peace Implementation Council or the contact group. So if you had a problem, you could call on them to put pressure on the local parties to cooperate. And thirdly, to be frank, the international community was the government. You know, remember, it had the full responsibility. And you look at somewhere like Afghanistan, obviously, you know, the Taliban have not given up fighting. There's no peace agreement. They haven't signed. So that you can't hold them to obligations. You cannot sort of have a military phase stop and then begin civilian reconstruction, because progress on the civilian side is a key part of gaining people's trust in the military operations. So you have to do the two simultaneously, and I think this is proving to be very difficult.
That's one of the lessons we take from Afghanistan. That's why I would think that NATO over time should get much better and is getting better at these operations, because we're just learning with every one of those engagements. We're taking home another one of those lessons in how to do it, actually. I'd like to expand the question to another aspect of operations. More and more of these operations are with a fairly wide range of partners. We discussed already, you know, the civil partners of it. But in many of the operations, alliance members or the alliance as such reaches out to other partners, because it's part of the strategy of building legitimacy, is bringing in local or regional actors into operations. How does that work? What's your take on that?
Well, I think this has been one of the amazing success stories. I say this quite openly. I was at a meeting a couple of days ago at NATO headquarters to discuss the transition in Afghanistan from NATO to the Afghan army and police to their leadership, which, as you know, is starting. And we invited all of the countries contributing to the ISAF mission, and it was basically almost like a mini United Nations, at least in terms of the number of countries around the table. I counted well over 60, and the NATO Supreme Allied Commander has calculated that there are 2 more in this coalition than there were in the Grand Alliance of World War II, which is quite extraordinary. You see countries like Tonga, you see Mongolia, you see Arab countries as well who are assisting the operation. So it's truly a rainbow coalition in the full sense of the term. We've even had offers from Colombia, for example, in Latin America to contribute forces. Now, I think this is good for legitimacy. Obviously, if you're in a Muslim country, it's good to show that there are countries also from the Muslim world, if I don't like that term, but at least for want of a better one, that are participating. It gives you legitimacy as well to have that broad coalition. And frankly, many of these countries do provide real capabilities. For example, Australia is, I think, the 7th or 8th largest contributor with forces in the south of the country, Uruzgan, where much of the fighting has taken place. So they provide real assets. However, just to answer your question, I think this has 2 major implications for NATO. because it now seems, and look at Libya, where we've got Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, Sweden also participating. It now seems that it's going to be very almost unthinkable that NATO does another operation, except for Article 5 collective defence, just with its own members. Automatically these operations will open up. So the first consequence of that is how can we show those partners that we are treating them as equals? Because if you put your troops on the line, you want to be considered like an ally. You know, access to intelligence, access to decision making, briefings, you want to approve the planning. So ultimately the old distinction between a NATO member and a non-NATO member gets somewhat fuzzy as a result, and I think this is a key question. The second thing that strikes me, and I'm interested in your view, is that of course, you know, much of this partnership has been built up around Afghanistan with Australia, Japan, New Zealand, countries across the globe. If Afghanistan does come to an end in 2014, how do we sort of preserve this ability to work together? Do we have exercises? Do we work on interoperability so that if another big mission like Afghanistan comes along in the future, you know, we don't have to start from scratch and reinvent all of the procedures again because we've preserved all of these connections? I think that's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah. Well, I think basically it's two big questions in this. On the first one, I'd like to throw it back to you because you should know from inside NATO is it sure makes a difference whether you are partnering with non-alliance members in the combat phase of an operation or when it's the post-conflict, or it's the peacekeeping or the order-building phase. Even if it's about robust peacekeeping, it's still a different thing than in the phase where you still in the process of achieving your initial military targets. Yeah. And I would believe that the alliance find it more difficult to truly adopt non-member states, especially when they are from fairly far politically, not geographically, but politically, from the core set of values and policies of the alliance, to fully share intelligence, to fully embed them in a command and communication structure. So I'll put that back to you and then get back to the other question.
No, but it's a good question. The fact of the matter is that you need quite a broad coalition to do these operations, because you look at Afghanistan, the farther away, as you say, from your home country, the more you need bases in the region. Look at Central Asia for Afghanistan, or transit routes across Russia or across Pakistan, because obviously you have to take the supplies directly there. Look at, for example, the problem we have with getting fuel trucks up through the Khyber Pass, where they're often attacked by insurgent groups, and military forces consume vast amounts of fuel every day, as you know. So this can be a headache. But also you need, not just these physical transit routes, but you need legal agreements with some of the countries when it comes to overflights, basing, and then you start getting into tricky areas such as SOFAs. We're not sitting on a sofa here, we're on chairs, but SOFA being status of forces agreement, with issues like who has jurisdiction. So I think that yes, one of the things that we are going to have to do if we're going to continue to do these operations is try to work out these arrangements in advance. I mean, the thing that I remember a few years ago, I think it was 2006, when there was this earthquake in Kashmir, when NATO sent the NATO response force. And because we had no legal agreement with Pakistan at the time, when the NATO response force arrived in Karachi, they were stuck for days. Could they bring in their equipment? Did they have to pay customs duties? Were they able to wear arms? What about jurisdiction? Sometimes you need to send your lawyers in first, your troops in second. But to answer your question, if we are able to conclude these arrangements in advance, then this gives us a lot more flexibility to move quickly in crisis. But it also shows, and this I think is the answer to your question, that even if there may be governments of a different sort of complexion to North Canada, US and Europe, the allied countries, that, of course, cannot prevent cooperation. We still have to reach understandings. We still have to build a confidence. Even countries that don't see eye to us on everything are still opposed to the Taliban returning to power in Afghanistan because the drugs, for example, or the terrorism undermine their security. So it's true that it's always best to work on common values where you can, and a great number of countries share those values, but you also have to work on common security interests and build up these relations of trust over time.
On that other point you made about how do you sustain this kind of cooperation after a crisis.
Well, what do you think about that? Do you think we're able to do that with such a broad coalition?
I think it has a chance to be developed probably around two clusters of issues. If there is a stable consensus emerging among actors of the international community. It won't be the entire international community, but hopefully a range of actors from very different geographical and political backgrounds. The one notion would be the responsibility to protect. Which probably
seems to have made a comeback with Libya in terms of that being
although a very complicated one, because it best fits a situation where you have basically the unarmed population in a country that is maltreated by its government. That's the classic case of responsibility to protect. While in Libya, it very soon had become then an armed struggle, however asymmetric, between various tribal agreements with one tribal group having control over all the army. So, but responsibility to protect certainly is something that is going to stay with us, and that is probably a mobilizer of consensus. It may be difficult and may be very hard at times to actually define the cases properly, but probably this is something where you have a group of countries that would take a consistent interest in preparing for cases that could and will come along. The other area I see is all of these transnational flows of transport routes, of communication lines and all that, because there is a wide range of actors that is affected by that. Whatever they think in terms of their political, religious, ethnic, or what have you, beliefs or convictions, this is something that affects them commonly. And so I would assume that one of the post-Afghanistan, post-broad coalition exercises would be to say, what do we need to do in order to maintain a certain level of informedness, of readiness, of capabilities, in order to restore communication, to restore transport, and interdict those interruptions. And there, I think you will see the Chinese as active as the Australians over the longer term.
Well, you're right, because I mean, the Chinese and the Indians, I think in the case of the Chinese, the first time since the Middle Ages or the Renaissance period, have sent a ship to the Gulf of Aden because they're also concerned about threats to their oil tankers or their oil supplies through piracy. So that's really interesting. I agree with you on that one. I mean, the military have this term called the global commons. Some like it, some like it less. But it is an attempt to describe the fact that you're right. In our age of globalization, we get our products from farther and farther afield. So transport, whether it be in space, cyberspace, land, sea, air, it becomes an increasingly part of our economic health and stability. And it's interesting to see now, you're right, a number of operations like the piracy operation, which are an attempt, not to so much to defeat an enemy or to rebuild a country, but just to keep a vital supply line, a choke point operating. But as we come to this, and as we come to the end of our cafe dialogue this evening, the big question is that if you look at the strategic concept, NATO was sort of saying, well, there are operations, but there are going to be lots of other things in the 21st century. It won't just be about operations any longer. We'll have cyber defense, we'll have proliferation, we'll have terrorism, we'll have lots of new things. But you look at Libya, the answer seems to be it's about operations, operations and operations. Do you think that, the final question for you tonight, Josef, that in the 21st century, at least for the next decade, NATO's raison d'etre, is still essentially going to be that we do operations and that's where our utility lies?
Well, it does, of course, reinforce the insight into the added value of the alliance if you have operations and they actually deliver on the goals and achieve the kind of outcome. I would assume, however, that the whole concept of operations will become a bit broader. The issues you were mentioning, like cybersecurity, information warfare, transport routes, or economic security, energy security, and all of that has a lot more of preventive action in it, has a lot of military operations or operations involving military means. If only intelligence and military planning, that will not be as visible. That will not be tomahawks being fired or jet planes up in the air, but will rather be going on behind the scene. You will notice it by things not happening, you know, by attacks not coming.
That's very interesting, yes.
And I believe this is an area where NATO is probably in need of building as many partnerships as possible, as having, you know, those effective outreaches, because this is a borderless set of issues that we're faced with. And so I would assume that NATO operations will change accordingly. And every once in a while, when really the crisis heats up in the way it did now in Libya, it will then in the end come to a classic military operation with all of the application of NATO's technology of planning capabilities that we see now.
So operations for prevention, operations for reaction, to restore what people call resilience, in other words, to get your systems back up and running as quickly as possible to minimize disruption, but also classical military operations. So yes, the answer is NATO remains an organisation that essentially defines itself through its operations, but it's going to have to broaden the spectrum and become a lot more sophisticated, and also being able to deal with invisible operations, like people sitting behind a computer screen. You may not think they're doing much, but they could be preventing a massive cyber attack on your air traffic control system or your electricity grid. So they're in the front line just as much as soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan.
And I think that's part of the reality of this world that we're facing. On the one hand, it is all good. It is very good that an increasing percentage of the world population is actually participating in what goes on. But that increases the fragility. That increases the risks to the well-being of all of us, and so it doesn't put NATO out of business. You know, even if we're much closer, if we're much more compatible, even if the number of armed conflicts in the end would actually go down, we still need to remain on the alert, because the higher the level of interdependence, the more dangerous the interruption of flows, the more imminent the risks of regional and local conflicts are for all of us.
Yeah, well, that suggests to me, as we sort of finish our drink this evening and together, maybe look forward to the next drink we're going to have together next week, that if there's going to be this multiplicity of operations, is NATO at the moment equipped to handle all of those, beyond the classical military type that we were talking about? You know, do we have the civilian soldiers for cyberspace that in the way that we have the military soldiers for counterinsurgency? And what about this major financial crisis that's hitting us and is reducing our capabilities? Are the threats going up at a time when our capabilities to address those threats are becoming terribly squeezed, which also would put a question mark over NATO's ability to respond? But anyway, I think that that's enough for one drink and one evening, Joseph. It was good to see you here.
Cheers,
and
Jamie.
Look forward to our next meeting.
It was a pleasure.
All the best for the rest of the evening. Bye. You know, partners are now part of virtually every aspect of NATO.
NATO was formed in a strategic environment that was very clear on in and out. Now we have a much more diffuse order.
So a more flexible type of partnership with more political consultations, more crisis prevention. That's one of the ideas.
Not a formal guarantee, but in a way an assurance that their security concerns would not be disregarded by NATO.
The partnership is moving from a community of values now to a more pragmatic, even realpolitik type of arrangement based on trying to find common interests. You know, partnerships are not just individual countries, they're also other international organizations.